What if the loudest sound in world politics wasn't the roar of war or the clash of armies, but a single sentence that froze presidents, silenced journalists, and made the entire globe hold its breath? Would you want to know what happened next? What if the greatest shift in modern diplomacy did not come from a war, not from an army marching across borders, not even from the weight of sanctions or secret treaties, but from a single sentence? Imagine for a moment that the loudest sound in a conference hall was not applause, not speeches, not even protest. It was silence. A silence so heavy that journalists froze mid-keystroke, translators hesitated, and seasoned leaders stared at one another as if history itself had just walked in. That is the mystery that pulled me in. And it might change the way you think about power forever. Good day, everyone. I want to take you back to a moment that looked ordinary at first glance. A summit hall where world leaders gathered for another day of routine speeches on trade, growth, and cooperation. Nothing in that room suggested the extraordinary was only minutes away. People were adjusting ties, setting up microphones, flipping through papers. Predictable, almost forgettable. And then the air shifted. It was as if the atmosphere itself knew something the people did not. A young leader, calm and steady, walked toward the podium. There was no drama in his step, no raised fist, no storm in his voice. Yet the weight he carried was undeniable. What came next was not a long speech, not a dramatic threat of war. It was just one sentence. But that single line had the sharpness of a blade. It cut through routine like thunder cracking across a quiet sky. In that instant, the ordinary collapsed, and the hall turned into a stage for history. Why did this strike me so deeply? Because it shattered everything we assume about power. We grow up believing it belongs to nations with armies, with weapons, with endless resources. But here was proof, played out before our eyes, that sometimes the strongest weapon is timing, patience, and words. For 4 long days, he had said nothing, even as anger spread across continents over leaked remarks made behind closed doors. Some believed he was afraid. Others thought he had missed his chance. But what if that silence was not weakness at all? What if it was strategy? What if he was waiting for the one moment when the world could not look away? That is what makes this story unforgettable. It is not only about the sentence that was spoken, but about the silence before it. The stillness that built tension, the patience that allowed outrage to grow, and then the precision of speaking at the exact moment when attention was at its peak. That silence was not emptiness. It was the quiet before an earthquake. When the words finally came, they carried more force than an army. They drew a line in front of the cameras that no one expected, a line so clear that even the most experienced diplomats had no script to follow. The chatter died. The room froze. And in that stillness, the balance of power tilted, even if only for a moment. I remember watching the footage later and feeling the tension in my chest as if I had been there myself. It was not the roar of a crowd or the chaos of argument. It was the opposite. The absence of sound became the loudest message of all. For a brief moment, history itself seemed to hold its breath. And that is when I realized, sometimes the most terrifying thing in global politics is not the threat of war. It is a demand for dignity, delivered in words so simple, yet impossible to ignore. That is why this story matters. Because it shows us that the script of power can be rewritten in ways we do not expect. A leader from a small, often overlooked nation can step forward and, with just one sentence, force the world to stop and listen. That is not the power of weapons. That is the power of presence. And it raises questions we cannot push aside. Was this a reckless gamble that risked too much, or was it the beginning of a new chapter, one where dignity is placed above negotiation? I cannot give you the final answer yet, but I can promise you this. Once you hear how that moment unfolded, once you feel the silence of that hall and the shockwaves that followed, you may never look at world politics the same way again. Because history does not always change with bombs or treaties. Sometimes it changes with a single sentence spoken at exactly the right time. So if you are ready to go deeper into this story with me, stay tuned, because the next few minutes will take you inside the drama, the strategy, and the consequences that reshaped the conversation around an entire continent. And before we dive in, I want to ask for your support. Please subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful stories like this one. Stories that don't just report headlines, but uncover the turning points that redefine our world. What makes a single moment unforgettable? Is it the words themselves or the silence that surrounds them? I asked myself that as I replayed the footage of what happened in that summit hall. Everyone remembers the sentence, the ultimatum that froze the room. But the truth is, the real story might lie in what happened before he spoke. For days, there was nothing but quiet. No fiery remarks, no rushed press conference, no quick reaction to the storm that was spreading across continents. And that is what makes me believe this was not a sudden impulse, but a deliberate choice. In the hours leading up to that day, the headlines had already taken on a life of their own. Leaked comments from closed-door meetings had ignited outrage far beyond diplomatic circles. It wasn't just politicians or journalists talking anymore. It had spilled into homes, classrooms, and city streets. People felt insulted, dismissed, and sidelined yet again. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of growing frustration. Social media platforms burned with anger. Opinion columns debated the disrespect. Protesters raised their voices in public squares. And through it all, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. At first, many saw that silence as weakness. I remember commentators calling him hesitant, afraid to step into the storm. Others assumed the moment had passed him by, theory that the fire would burn out before he ever responded. But looking back now, I see it differently. That silence was not the absence of action. It was a kind of preparation, a gathering of strength. He let the anger spread. He allowed the sense of injustice to grow, and he waited. Waiting is not glamorous. It doesn't make headlines. But sometimes waiting is the boldest move a leader can make. And then came the choice of stage. This is where I believe the brilliance lies. He didn't pick a press briefing that could have been buried by other stories. He didn't call an interview where his words might have been edited, softened, or ignored. He chose the African Development Summit, a gathering already broadcast across the world. It was a stage no one could dismiss, a spotlight that reached far beyond the hall itself. That decision turned what could have been a defensive statement into a global declaration. Suddenly, the question was no longer about the insult itself. The question became, how would Africa respond? That shift in framing is what fascinates me. It's easy to speak in anger. It's much harder to hold your tongue until the moment when silence itself becomes a weapon. By waiting 4 days, Traoré transformed the narrative. His words were no longer just a reply to leaked remarks. They became a message that embodied years of frustration, decades of being spoken about rather than spoken to. It wasn't simply about one man or one country anymore. It was about dignity on a continental scale. When I think about that strategy, I'm struck by how simple it seemed, and yet how rare it is in modern politics. In a world where news travels in seconds, where leaders rush to comment on every controversy, here was someone who chose to do the opposite. He slowed everything down. He let the silence breathe until people couldn't ignore it anymore. And when he finally spoke, it felt less like a reaction and more like the closing argument in a case the whole world had already been debating. Of course, this raises another question. Was it calculated, or was it instinct? Did he and his advisors spend those days planning every word, every gesture, every pause? Or was it the natural decision of someone who understood that dignity can't be defended with haste? We may never know the full answer. But what is clear is that the timing changed everything. A sentence spoken too early might have been forgotten by the next news cycle. A sentence spoken too late might have missed the moment entirely. But a sentence spoken at exactly the right time has the power to echo far beyond its original setting. And that is what happened here. One line, delivered at the perfect moment, carried the weight of a continent. It was no longer just a remark in a conference hall. It was replayed across television screens, debated in studios, shared endlessly online. It became a symbol people could hold on to, something that gave shape to feelings that had been building for years. And I believe that was the real intention, not just to respond to an insult, but to claim a narrative that had so often been written by others. So when I ask myself what made this moment so powerful, I keep coming back to the silence. It was not wasted time. It was the foundation of everything that came after. And it leaves me wondering, how many times in history have we mistaken silence for weakness, when in fact it was the most strategic move of all? That is the lesson I carry from this event, and it is why I believe this story still matters long after the headlines faded. What does it feel like to stand in a room at the exact moment history changes? I asked myself that question as I studied the footage of the African Development Summit. On the surface, it looked no different from countless other gatherings of world leaders. Delegates flipped through papers, journalists hunched over laptops, translators adjusted their headsets, and aides shuffled quietly in the background. The atmosphere was routine, even dull. Nothing suggested that within minutes, the air would become so heavy that no one could move, speak, or even breathe in the same way again. Then, the camera caught a figure entering the hall. A man in uniform, calm and steady, walking toward the podium. There was no rush in his step, no fiery gestures to command attention. If anything, his movements were understated, almost ordinary. And yet, as he advanced, you could sense the shift. People turned their heads, conversations grew quieter, and the kind of silence that falls before a storm began to settle over the room. When he reached the podium, the stillness deepened. He did not clear his throat. He did not shuffle papers. He simply paused. For a heartbeat, all you could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the creak of chairs as delegates adjusted themselves, waiting for another predictable speech. But what they received instead was a sentence that none of them could have rehearsed for. The words were delivered slowly, deliberately, each syllable striking with the weight of finality. He did not shout. He did not raise his hand for effect. He spoke as if every word had already been carved in stone, unshakable and irreversible. And as his voice carried through the hall, the reaction was instant. Journalists froze mid-keystroke. Translators hesitated for the briefest of moments before repeating his words. Delegates leaned toward one another, exchanging glances of disbelief. A line had been drawn, and everyone in that room knew they had just crossed into something new. I tried to imagine myself sitting there, expecting nothing more than a series of polite speeches on economic cooperation. How would it feel to suddenly realize that the story of the day had shifted entirely? One moment, you're preparing to file a standard report. The next, you find your fingers hovering uselessly over the keyboard, because the weight of what you just heard makes words seem inadequate. That is what struck me most about the scene. The way routine shattered in an instant. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, almost electric. It was the kind of silence that presses down on a room, making every breath feel louder than it should. Even those who had attended dozens of such summits, people who were trained to remain composed no matter what unfolded, looked unsettled. Some sat stiffer in their chairs. Others whispered hurriedly to colleagues. But no one could pretend that what had just happened was ordinary. Watching the footage, I found myself drawn not only to the words spoken, but to the small details around them. The camera captured a South African delegate nodding ever so slightly, as if to say, "Finally." A European representative leaned in close to whisper something to his neighbor, his expression tense. Even the interpreters, usually mechanical in their delivery, betrayed a fraction of hesitation before continuing. These fragments, these tiny human reactions, told me more than any headline could. They revealed just how deeply that one sentence had cut through the polished surface of diplomacy. And it was not just the people inside that hall who felt it. Within minutes, the footage was broadcast to control rooms around the world. Anchors interrupted scheduled programming to replay the clip. Analysts scrambled to interpret its meaning. Online, ordinary people watched and rewatched, debating its significance, sharing it, remixing it, turning it into something larger than a single moment. The ripple had begun inside a silent hall, but by the time the sun was overhead in Addis Ababa, the echo had already stretched across oceans. That is the part that lingers with me, the contrast between the simplicity of the scene and the enormity of its impact. No fireworks, no chaos, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man at a podium, steady voice, calm presence, and a sentence that could not be ignored. Sometimes history announces itself with loud explosions and grand gestures. But sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary moment, until suddenly you realize you have witnessed something that will be remembered long after the room empties. As I think back to that morning, I can almost feel the weight of that silence myself. It wasn't just a pause between words. It was recognition, a collective understanding that a threshold had been crossed. And that is why this story matters. Because once a moment like that takes place, once a hall falls quiet in a way that cannot be forgotten, history has already been written. The only question that remains is how far its echoes will reach. What makes a single sentence so powerful that it can bend the mood of an entire summit? Is it the words themselves, or the strategy that shapes them long before they are spoken? I find myself returning to this question again and again, because it is not just about what was said in Addis Ababa, but how it was delivered and why it landed with such force. To me, the most overlooked detail is the silence that came before. For 4 days, while headlines screamed about leaked remarks and anger spread across cities and screens, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. At the time, that silence looked like hesitation. Commentators framed it as fear, as if he might let the storm pass by without stepping into it. But now, with distance, I see it differently. The silence was not weakness. It was a calculated pause. By holding back, he allowed the outrage to grow, to spill out of diplomatic circles and into homes and streets. He did not fight the fire. He let it burn until it lit up the sky. And then he chose his moment. Not a side interview, not a rushed statement outside a press room, but the African Development Summit, a stage where every eye and every camera was already fixed. That choice is what transformed his words from a personal response into a global declaration. It was no longer just about disproving an insult. It was about shifting the center of gravity. The narrative was no longer controlled by those who made the remarks behind closed doors. It was now shaped by the continent that had been slighted. This is why I believe timing mattered more than the ultimatum itself. If he had spoken earlier, his words might have been dismissed as a reactive outburst. If he had waited too long, the moment might have slipped away. But by speaking at the exact point when the world could not look away, he made sure the sentence could not be ignored. That is not chance. That is strategy. Of course, not everyone saw it as brilliance. Critics quickly pointed out the risks. How could a small, landlocked country confront a powerful nation without paying the price? What if investors pulled back or alliances cracked under the pressure? Some labeled it reckless, a dangerous gamble that could backfire and isolate more than it empowered. And those criticisms cannot be dismissed lightly. In a global system where influence often depends on economics, such a move carried obvious risks. But here is the paradox I cannot ignore. The very thing that made it risky also made it unforgettable. Playing it safe would have meant another polite statement buried beneath other headlines. Instead, this ultimatum cut through the noise. It forced attention in a way no careful phrasing ever could. Yes, it risked backlash, but it also ignited conversations across continents, far beyond the walls of that summit hall. The brilliance of the move, in my eyes, lies in how it redefined the conversation. It was no longer about whether the leaked remarks were true. The focus shifted to Africa's response, to dignity and respect as the new terms of debate. That shift is harder to measure than policy outcomes, but it matters more than most people realize. Once dignity becomes the center of the conversation, it cannot easily be pushed aside again. As I watched the reactions unfold, I thought about how fragile global diplomacy often is. Leaders usually speak in cautious tones, wrapped in layers of careful language designed to offend no one and change very little. And yet here was someone doing the opposite, cutting through that cautious script with words as sharp as a blade. It was unsettling, yes, but it was also refreshing. It reminded the world that diplomacy is not only about smoothing tensions. Sometimes it is about drawing a line so clear that no one can mistake where you stand. What makes this moment so compelling to me is not just that a leader dared to confront power, but that he did it with such precision. It was not anger spilling out unchecked. It was a demand measured to the second, sharpened by silence, amplified by timing. Whether one agrees with the substance or not, the method itself was a masterclass in how to seize the narrative. So I return to my question, what makes a single sentence so powerful? Perhaps it is this, the ability to turn silence into thunder, to wait until the world is listening, and then to speak so plainly that no one can look away. That is what happened in Addis Ababa, and that is why the moment continues to resonate. Because once a leader shows that words can shift the balance, even for an instant, it changes the way we think about power itself. And it reminds us that sometimes the boldest risk is also the one that cannot be forgotten. What happens when a sentence escapes the room where it was spoken and begins to live a life of its own? That is the question I keep asking myself as I think about what unfolded after that declaration in Addis Ababa. It wasn't just the people inside the summit hall who felt the weight of those words. Within hours, the world had picked them up, replayed them, argued over them, and in some places, embraced them as if they were their own. One sentence became a symbol, and that symbol carried further than anyone in that room could have imagined. Almost immediately, news channels interrupted their programming to broadcast the clip. Anchors replayed it again and again, their voices heavy with the recognition that something unusual had just happened. Analysts in Washington, Paris, and Beijing tried to explain what it meant, scrambling to fit it into the familiar patterns of diplomacy, but the truth was that it didn't fit. This wasn't another routine disagreement, easily tucked into diplomatic language. It was something raw, something that struck at the very idea of dignity on the world stage. On social media, the words took on a life of their own. Hashtags multiplied, clips were shared across platforms, and soon the phrase, "Africa is not your pawn," was impossible to miss. It wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. What began as a statement directed at one leader had turned into a rallying cry that reached across languages and borders. I watched as people in cities far from Addis Ababa picked it up: Johannesburg, Lagos, Nairobi, but also London, New York, and Kingston. In each place, the phrase carried a slightly different shade of meaning, but the heartbeat was the same: respect, dignity, and the refusal to be ignored. Inside Africa, the sentence resonated like an echo of something long felt but rarely voiced so directly. Leaders who had once spoken cautiously began to use stronger words. Journalists, who had often reported Africa's struggles from the margins, suddenly found themselves writing about Africa as a center of gravity. Diaspora communities carried the sentence into protests, classrooms, and street marches. It connected them not only to the present, but to a lineage of voices from the past, voices that had demanded respect, sovereignty, and justice in earlier eras. For me, the most powerful part of this transformation was not just how quickly it spread, but how it changed the frame of the conversation. Before the ultimatum, the story was about leaked remarks and diplomatic insult. After it, the story became something much larger: how Africa responds to disrespect, how it demands recognition, and how it asserts a role in shaping the global narrative. That shift may sound subtle, but it is profound. The sentence recentered the story around dignity, not damage. Still, the reaction was not uniform. Some saw the ultimatum as reckless, even dangerous. They worried about the consequences for a country that dared to confront a far stronger one. Economists whispered about possible fallout. Diplomats cautioned against alienation. Yet even in the criticism, there was an acknowledgement that the moment could not be ignored. The very fact that so many debated it, that so many weighed the risks and rewards, proved that the sentence had already succeeded. It had forced attention, and attention is its own kind of power. As the hours passed and the 48-hour countdown ticked across headlines, the world found itself caught in suspense. Would there be an apology? Would the ultimatum lead to fallout or compromise? The anticipation itself became part of the drama. People watched not just for the outcome, but for what it symbolized. It was as though the sentence had created a stage where the world had to decide how seriously it would take Africa's voice. What I find most striking, looking back, is how something so simple managed to stir such complexity. A sentence spoken calmly in a hall became a storm across continents. It became protest chants, news analysis, online debates, dinner table conversations. It became a test of whether dignity can be ignored once it has been demanded so clearly. That is the extraordinary thing about words. They can travel faster than armies, cut deeper than sanctions, and last longer than headlines. So I return to the question: what happens when a sentence escapes the room? In this case, it grew into a symbol that no one could control once it was released. It reminded me that history often moves not in predictable steps, but in jolts that no one can prepare for. And even if the immediate outcome didn't deliver every demand, the sentence had already done its work. It had shown that Africa's voice, once spoken with clarity, cannot be unheard. That is the lasting power of that moment in Addis Ababa. Not just that a leader dared to set a deadline, but that the words themselves transformed into something larger than him, larger than the summit, larger than the original insult. They became a mirror in which the world had to see Africa differently. And once that mirror has been held up, you cannot easily turn away. Looking back on that extraordinary moment in Addis Ababa, what stands out most to me is not just the words that were spoken, but the way they transformed silence into a powerful force. A single sentence turned a routine summit into a turning point that rippled far beyond the walls of that hall. It reminded the world that power is not always measured in armies or wealth, but sometimes in dignity and timing. What began as one leader's ultimatum quickly became a symbol for millions, proving that when a voice is raised with conviction, it can no longer be ignored. This moment captured the essence of history's unpredictability. It often shifts, not through grand wars or treaties, but through words delivered at the precise moment when the world is listening. For me personally, the deeper lesson here is about the value of patience and the courage to speak at the right time. We live in a world that pushes us to respond instantly, to react quickly, and to fill silence with noise. Yet this story shows that silence, when used wisely, can be a strategy rather than a weakness. It teaches us that waiting is not the same as surrendering. It can be preparation, allowing the moment to build until our words carry the greatest impact. In our daily lives, this might mean holding back from responding in anger during conflict, or choosing to wait for the right opportunity to share an idea, ask for respect, or stand up for ourselves. When we finally do speak, our words may resonate more deeply because we chose them carefully and delivered them with purpose. The second lesson is about dignity. Respect is not something that can be given or taken lightly. It must be claimed, and once claimed, it changes how others see us and how we see ourselves. Whether in personal relationships, work, or community, setting boundaries with calm but firm words can shift dynamics in a way that no amount of noise ever could. So I ask you this: how do you choose when to remain silent and when to finally speak up? I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below so we can all learn from one another's perspectives. And if you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing powerful reflections and meaningful stories your way.